So now I'll give the word to Elton Small, who is a current student at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and he will be coming here to Berlin next year.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Daniela, for the introduction. So I am just going to pull up my slides and then hopefully begin. Yeah, so I'll be speaking about European Union enlargement in the Western Balkans. And this is a region that is very near and dear to me. I'm half Albanian, and I'm currently studying Serbo-Croatian here at UNC as a FLAS fellow, and I'll be continuing to study Serbo-Croatian language next year. And my master's thesis in Berlin will be focusing on integration of Balkan diasporas in Germany. So for those who might not be as familiar with the region, I just wanted to start off with kind of like a general picture of the Western Balkans. It really is such a rich and diverse region of Europe, and for that reason is so special to me, especially with my family heritage there. As you can see here at the top left, the Grand Mosque in Tirana. The bottom right, you have an Orthodox Christian monastery in Serbia. Baklava may be familiar to a lot of you, very popular in this region, and as a result in Germany as well. And so part of the kind of richness and diversity of the Balkans does have to do with its history. Um, just a brief overview here, you can see kind of the countries that make up this region. Um, it essentially includes the Western Balkans, includes the former Yugoslavia as well as Albania. And this region at the turn of the 20th century was mostly under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. They had wars of independence around 1912, and then in the interwar period, had monarchies up until World War II. Following World War II, the region fell under communist rule, so Yugoslavia, mostly under Tito, in the northern part of this region, and then Albania was a communist dictatorship under the rule of Enver Hoxha. So those regimes lasted up until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and then it entered a turbulent period of transition with revolutions through 1991, toppling of those regimes, and then the 1990s was the transition to capitalism, to free market and democratic societies, which was very, very turbulent and in many cases resulted in ethnic conflict and ethnic cleansing in the case of Bosnia and Kosovo. So these challenges have continued to impede the region's development and integration with Europe, but there has been progress, which is what I'm excited to share. So this region really does want to become a part of the European Union. There's a lot of reasons for this. I mean, just practically speaking, for one, it would give people in the Balkans the freedom of movement, freedom to work across Europe, hosts of new economic opportunities. It would also include adoption of the euro as the currency, so providing more economic stability. Although, interesting side note, two countries in this region have already adopted the euro unilaterally. So Kosovo and Montenegro both use the euro, although because this was a unilateral move, which wasn't really approved by the European Union. It also means that these countries aren't represented in the European Central Bank, so they can't really influence monetary policy. So it's a trade-off, but it's not the same as adopting the euro officially. And then, of course, another reason is joining the EU would help ground democratic institutions in this region. And on the one hand, there has been a lot of talk about democratic backsliding in the EU, especially in the case of Hungary and Viktor Orban, and it's easy to be concerned about that. But I think if you really put the EU in perspective and think about the fact that throughout the entire 20th century, the region was largely authoritarian, and even going up to, in Spain, up to the 1970s, it was still a dictatorship. Greece also had pervasive authoritarianism up until the second half of the 20th century. And so the European Union really has been effective in promoting lasting democracy in Europe. And one argument is that uh, expanding the EU to this region would help democratic development as well. Although there is some cause for skepticism. So we can just go through kind of the differences here in these countries. Albania and Kosovo are almost overwhelmingly in support of joining. Montenegro is up there as well. North Macedonia is one case where some skepticism has grown, largely because of the vetoes that have been blocking their accession, which are kind of reminiscent of the case of Turkey, which for decades had been trying to join the EU, um, never did, and then now has seen erosion of democratic institutions, crackdown on freedom of speech. And the story of Turkey especially creates some anxiety where people fear that they're being led on by the EU and that they're being given false promises that may never materialize. In the case of Serbia, it is also an exception in this region, largely because of its historic and cultural ties with Russia, large support for Russia's war in Ukraine, and also an extreme resentment over the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia during the Kosovo War, which still creates a lot of anti-Western sentiments in Serbia. But Serbia really is kind of one foot in the West and one foot in the East, kind of unique case. So you may wonder, how does a country join the EU? So I just want to kind of go over the accession process briefly. The first step, of course, is becoming a candidate. So this is granted by unanimous decision of the European Council, which, just as a review, the Council is made up of the heads of state of the member states, the 27 member states of the EU. And this candidacy is also informed by recommendations from the Commission. So the Council and candidate country then agree on the negotiation framework for accession, which is also drafted by the Commission and then adopted by member states. And this negotiation framework includes principles, substance, and procedures of the negotiation, and it builds on the experiences of previous waves of enlargement. And once you get to this point, negotiations can begin. And this is the longest period in the accession process, usually, where the candidate country must adapt its own laws to the EU's 35 aqueous chapters, which range from freedom of movement, free of goods, energy, tax policy, defense and security, and environment and climate regulations. So this is just the process of adopting the EU's rules and regulations as a requirement to become a member state. Once this is achieved, a treaty can be signed between the candidate country and the EU. It has to be approved by all three branches, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. And then it has to be ratified by each current member state of the EU and by the candidate country again, which sometimes calls for a referendum depending on the candidate country. So in the case of Slovenia, at this point, they held an internal referendum, which passed in support of joining. So currently, the conversation about accession has focused more on Ukraine and Moldova by extension, and there has kind of been a perception of these countries being put on a fast track to accession to the EU as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which started on February 24th of 2022. Just 4 days after the invasion, Ukraine applied to become a candidate for accession. And only less than 4 months after its application, it was granted candidacy status, which is by far the fastest in EU history compared to other countries which take years to reach that point. So, for instance, Albania had a period of more than 5 years between its application and becoming a candidate. For Bosnia, that was a period of 8 years. That's just between the application and becoming a candidate, let alone the negotiation process and everything else. So this has been perceived as a fast track. And Edi Rama and the Prime Minister of Albania commented in a conference with other European leaders that why don't all the Balkan nations just invade each other? Serbia can invade Kosovo, Bosnia, Greece can invade Albania, and then they'll let us into the EU just like they're doing to Ukraine. So this is also kind of playing on the history of tension between Balkan countries, but expressing the frustration of these countries, who have been working so hard over decades to implement the necessary reforms. Although there are really significant barriers still to Ukrainian accession, and it really is not a given that Ukraine will ever join, for a number of reasons that I'm not going to go into now. But there has been progress for the Balkans, even recently. So Bosnia became a candidate in 2022, and just last month, on March 21st, um, the talks with the EU for accession began. And this makes Bosnia the last country in the region to reach this point, except for Kosovo. But Kosovo has unique challenges that I'll get into later. So just looking at the Balkans as a whole, I just want to give some context for accession in the region. Slovenia was the first Balkan country to accede in 2004, but Slovenia was also the first country to break away from Yugoslavia and was the wealthiest region in Yugoslavia and has a closer kind of connection to Europe, bordering Austria. And Slovenia was part of the fifth wave of enlargement that also included a number of other Eastern European countries, including Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, and the Baltic states. Um, and yeah, just a note. So EU enlargement usually happens in waves rather than a single country being admitted. So that was the fifth wave. All of these Eastern European countries, sometimes referred to as the Big Bang wave of enlargement. And then the sixth wave included Romania and Bulgaria in 2007. Now, after Romania and Bulgaria were admitted to the EU, issues with corruption did persist. And so this has resulted in continued monitoring by the EU of progress in that country in these two countries, and has also meant that these countries were not immediately admitted into the Schengen zone of free movement. And so this actually only occurred on March 31st, 6 days ago. They were finally admitted to the Schengen zone, but there are still land border controls, but not for air and sea. And then Croatia was the most recent country to join the EU. This was in 2013. And interestingly, so that's more than a decade ago. This decade-long period from 2013 up until now is the longest period in the EU's history where a new state has not joined. So, and that goes all the way back to the first wave of enlargement in 1973, which was before the Maastricht Treaty and before this was even called the EU, when it was just called the European Economic Community. So this kind of slowing of enlargement can be attributed to what sometimes is referred to as enlargement fatigue. Is largely a result of the crises in the past decades that have faced the EU, including the Eurozone crisis starting in 2009 with Greece and the economic debt, and then the migrant crisis resulting from the Syrian civil war, which saw millions of refugees pouring into Europe, affecting domestic politics as well. Democratic backsliding, as I mentioned. Here you can see Viktor Orban shaking hands with Vladimir Putin. And so these are all things that have taken the EU's attention off of enlargement. But um, there is still significant progress being made in the Western Balkans, and there is a lot of potential. So I just want to kind of note within the EU the different philosophies on enlargement. It really has been Germany taking a leading role, with Chancellor Olaf Scholz emphasizing the need to include the Western Balkans and to make good on its promise to integrate them into the EU. On the contrary, France has really been an opponent to enlargement. So this kind of illustrates the widening versus deepening debate, where Germany is promoting widening, saying we should just expand, letting more people in will strengthen the EU, whereas France is saying no, these countries have to meet certain requirements. We should make stricter requirements and make sure that countries are up to a high bar before we let them in. So France vetoed Albania and Macedonia's negotiation talks in 2009. They finally did start negotiations in 2022, but it just does kind of show this internal debate. And this is important because, according to the accession procedures, it requires a unanimous decision, which means that every single country of the 27 member states has veto power and can stop the progress. So that is especially relevant in the example of North Macedonia, which has been trying to join the EU for decades now and has been recently blocked by two current member states. First, it was Greece, who blocked North Macedonia on account of their name, which goes back to kind of historic claims over Alexander the Great and his origin from a region called Macedonia, which both nations kind of claim as their heritage. So Macedonia, which at the time was called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, actually changed its name to North Macedonia at the request of Greece, which was largely unpopular in the country as well. But they finally, the president said it was worth, the political gamble to change the name, and Greece was happy. But then Bulgaria came along and said, no, now you have to admit that your language is just Bulgarian, but and you basically copied our language. So it just kind of goes into like these historic disputes in the Balkans that are really kind of emblematic of the political turmoil that has continued over the years, which is, the origin of the term Balkanization, where you have a dense region of multi-ethnic neighbors who have had these disputes. In the case of Kosovo, there's even greater barriers because there's currently 5 member states that don't even recognize Kosovo's sovereignty from Serbia. So one of those includes Spain. In the case of Spain, this is motivated by its own breakaway movements within its borders in Catalonia, the Basque Country, and the concern that recognizing Kosovo as independent would legitimize the breakaway movements within its own borders. So, of course, Kosovo would have to be recognized by all EU members if it had a chance of joining. And on top of that, Serbia has said that it will never recognize Kosovo's independence. So if Serbia were to join the EU, Kosovo would have to either join prior to that or simultaneously. Um, Now, despite these challenges, the EU has been investing largely in the region and in its accession. So part of this is under the Instrument for Pre-Accession Assistance. So there's been 3 phases of this so far. The first one starting in 2007 um, with 11 billion euros. The second going up to 12.8 billion euros. And then the third one starting in 2021 going all the way through 2027 is 14 billion euros, which the EU Commission describes as a sound investment in the future of both the enlargement region, the Western Balkans, and the EU and their common interests. This money is going to implement the necessary political and economic reforms, preparing them to be EU members, including including mutual interests and the interests of the EU, like having sustainable economic situation in Europe, coordinating on energy supply, transport, environmental policy, and just maintaining regional stability in the region. This money is tied to regional cooperation and neighborly relations. So, for example, the EU has pressured Bulgaria to act more neighborly towards North Macedonia and to adopt European values in that relationship. And this has been added on with the recent EU growth plan that began just in November of last year. This is another 6 billion euros to support Balkan accession. it's projected to double the size of these economies over the next 10 years. And it's focused on integration with the EU common market, focusing on freedom of goods and services, supply chains, and decarbonizing the energy market, which, of course, is a core tenet of the EU's energy policy now. And also establishing this common regional market, an inter-Balkan market up to EU standards, which is projected to result in 10% economic growth in the Western Balkans as well. So, on top of that, it goes into supporting reforms, which each country are taking to meet the accession criteria. Uh, and many of these countries have taken significant steps in the reform process. Albania, uh, over the past few years, fired more than half of judges in the country as part of a effort to root out corruption and ties to organized crime. So these are very significant steps that these countries are taking. And I just want to end on this note where this isn't just about negotiations in Brussels and dense legal documents, but it's about, the aspirations of the people of this region to create a brighter future for themselves, for their children, and to reach their fullest potential and to become a part of the European Union. So, yeah, thank you. I don't know if there's time for questions.